cease to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins which are many are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. And boy, there's a sarcastic thing in that statement. And he said to her, thy sins are forgiven. And they that were eating with him began to say within themselves, who is this that forgiveth sins also? And he said to the woman, thy faith has saved thee. Go in peace. Say, what's the story teaching? It's just showing us a very simple thing. Here was a woman who entered a Pharisee's home. The first response of that Pharisee would have been rude, would have been arrogance, would have been scorn to that woman. What are you doing in here, you filthy, vile, sinning woman? Out! And Jesus shielded the woman from the scorn and the arrogance and the rudeness and the indifference of the Pharisee. And Jesus loved the woman, and Jesus forgave the woman, and Jesus redeemed the woman. And Barclay is right when he translates the phrase this way: love does not behave gracelessly. Love is gracious. Love is never rude. And it isn't just a matter of whether you're rude to a believer, but love is never even rude to an unbeliever. I've seen some Christians who don't smoke, who were so rude to a non-Christian who did, that they would never have had an opportunity to communicate something about Christ. You know, we can get to the place where we've got all the doctrine and all the answers, and we become these theological hardheads, and we lose our grace and we lose our charm with people who aren't where we are. And that isn't right. We can close off the whole world except our little four and our little deal. Shut the door, us four, no more. And there's no grace. And there's no kindness. There's just a rudeness. You know, one of the things I believe that Christianity very often has to pay the price for is just plain rudeness to unbelieving people. We just are often very rude and thoughtless to people. I heard a preacher preaching a tirade against the ungodly that blasted them from pillar to post in a fashion that was totally unbiblical, that made them to be something they were not. And I thought to myself, I've never heard a man any more rude to unbelieving people than that man. He was a Pharisee who would have picked up that woman in Luke and thrown her right out the door. But that wasn't what Jesus did, was it? You know, love is not rude. And a good place to be is at home when you begin to practice this. Well, love can save us from the bitter sneer of envy and the ridiculous swagger of boastfulness. Love can save us from the inner tendency to be so inflated with our own importance that we're rude to everybody else, and the tendency to behave without grace as contemptuous of others and others' feelings. Seventh, I'll give you this one. Love seeks not its own. This is probably the key to everything. Love seeks not its own. It's the opposite of self-seeking. Love isn't interested in its own things. Love is interested in the things of someone else. Lenski, the great commentator, said this. He said, cure selfishness and you've just replanted the Garden of Eden. He's right. I would say that in the portrait of love, love seeks not its own are the eyes. They're unselfish eyes. The windows of the soul show the soul to be selfless. And the Corinthians were selfish. Oh, they were selfish. They were selfish in their spiritual gifts. You know what? In fact, if you look at chapter 14, verse 4, and he talks to them about their use of the gift of tongues, he says, he that speaks in a tongue edifies himself. And in verse 12, he says, seek that you may excel to the edifying of the church, not yourself. Even in the area of spiritual gifts, something that was good, they had twisted around to make it a selfish thing. Instead of using their gifts for others, they were using their gifts to build themselves up. But love is free from that. Love never dwells on itself. There was an interesting story told by Fulton Ausler some years ago He said there was a uniformed chauffeur that drove up to a cemetery, and there was a minister who took care of the cemetery, and he came out. Anyway, he came out to the car. I always get those confused. Came out to the car, and the chauffeur walked up, and the chauffeur said, "The lady is too ill to walk. Would you mind coming with me?" Waiting in the car was a frail, elderly woman whose sunken eyes could not hide some deep, long-lasting hurt. "I'm Mrs. So-and-so," she said weakly. "Every week for the last 2 years, I have been sending you a $5 bill in the mail." "Oh, yes, for the flowers," he remembered. "Yes, to be laid on the grave of my loved one. I came today," she confided softly, "because the doctors have let me know I have only a few weeks left and I shall not be able to live beyond that. And there's nothing to live for anyway, and so I wanted to drive for one last look at the grave." The clerk blinked at her irresolutely, says Ausler, and then with a very wry smile, he spoke, "You know, ma'am, I'm very sorry you kept sending the money for the flowers." "Sorry?" "Yes, because the flowers last such a little while, and no one ever sees them anyway." "Do you realize what you're saying?" she asked. "Oh, yes, I do. You see, I belong to a visiting society," he said. "State hospitals, insane asylums, people in places like that. They dearly love flowers, and they can see them and smell them, lady. There are living people in places like that." The woman sat in silence for a moment, and then without a word, she signaled the chauffeur to drive away. Some months later, the clerk was astonished to receive another visit. Doubly astonished because this time the woman was driving the car. "I take the flowers to the people myself," she said with a friendly smile, "at the hospitals." "You were right. It does make them happy, and it makes me happy, and the doctors don't know what is making me well, but I do. I have somebody else to live for." Well, I think Jesus was saying something about that when he said, "Bear ye one another's" what? "Burdens." So have somebody else to live for. Jesus did. The Son of Man is not come to be ministered unto, but to what? To minister and to give his life a ransom for many. Love never seeks its own. Love is always seeking somebody else's. This is the key to the whole concept of love. It is selflessness. You're patient with people. You're kind with people. You're not jealous of people. You're not angry with people. You're not upset with people. You're not provoked by people. You're very tolerant with people. You're very generous with people. You're very gracious with people. You're never rude to people. All of that means you're selfless. Let me give you the last one for this time. Number 8. And that's something I just mentioned. Love is not provoked.